Hello, 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 and welcome to Who's Views. It's Merchandise Paradise, and I am delighted to be welcoming a very special guest today. Hello to Paul Hayes. How are you, Paul?
I'm very well, thank you. Just hoping I can somehow live up to the billing of very special guest. Hopefully I won't disappoint anyone when they see it's me, some random bloke.
Some random, but not at all. Author extraordinaire. I'm really going to pile this onto you now because, listen, welcome to Who's Views. So glad to see you here. We are going to be talking, and by the way, if you are watching us, we are live. It's Tuesday. It's Tuesday evening. We are live. So if you've got any questions or anything you want to say to Paul, please do pop them into the comments, and we will actually be looking at those very shortly for you. Paul is very kindly come onto the show to talk about his two publications that are available right now from 10 Acre Films, and it's The Long Game and Pull to Open. Looking forward to talking about those. But before we do, because this is Merchandise Paradise, I always ask my guests that come onto this. Paul, you ready for this?
Yes.
And something tells me that the answer to this question might be in the affirmative, but you are a long-standing Doctor Who fan. Are you a Doctor Who fan that collects the merchandise, or are you a Doctor Who fan that doesn't? But I can see certain things behind you. So
yeah, you can probably see this isn't sort of specially set up, but because I only live in quite a small flat, it's the only really kind of decent angle that works on doing these webcam things. So it's got all my my DVDs and Blu-rays, and you can see the if I can work out where I am, the collection Blu-rays behind me on that side lined up, waiting for season 20 to be added. In terms of merchandise, I've always been I don't know if I've ever really been a completist about things. I've always had the kind of the basics, as it were, the DVDs and now, well, the VHSs back in the day.
Yes.
I was too young to really have assembled the complete range on VHS, but I had a lot of VHSs as I was growing up, and then onto the DVDs and got the range on DVDs, and now Blu-ray. I mean, I've bought Spearhead from Space about 4 times, I think, so far in my life. But so that kind of thing. Books as well. Again, I don't think I ever had any of the complete ranges of the books, but I had lots of New Adventures, Missing Adventures, EDAs, all those kinds of things, and Targets, and all those kind of stuff, and various of the non-fiction books. But in terms of beyond that, it's more kind of with other merchandise, toys and collectibles and things and bits and pieces. It's more that I'm not kind of anti that or anything. It's just not been my personal thing to collect. But I've ended up with bits and pieces of that kind of stuff, because I don't know if you find this, being a Doctor Who fan, particularly police boxes. People love giving you police boxes. I've got about half a dozen different police boxes of various kinds that different friends or colleagues or members of family have given me, different things. I've got like a USB multi-plug-in one.
Oh yes, I remember those.
I think my brother gave me for my birthday once magnetic sort of floating TARDIS that you put batteries in it and it floats between the poles of the magnets. And friends of mine once gave me the Lego set with the Capaldi and Matt Smith and Weeping Angels Lego set. So I'm there, and I've even been sent, because my day job, I'm a radio producer. I work at a radio station, and because I've been at that station for a long time, and some of the long-term listeners get to hear bits and pieces about my life. Things that some of them know that I'm a Doctor Who fan. I've been sent a couple of like ceramic TARDIS money boxes and this kind of thing. So I've been given lots of TARDISes down the years, so bits and pieces like that. But I'm not a. I think actually I've got some merch. I don't normally wear merch, but this was a present.
Merchandise. It's merchandise on this show, love.
But this was a gift from a colleague, my colleague Julie at work once a few years ago.
That's lovely. That one. Show us that design again. I don't think I've seen that one.
It's a Dalek blueprint t-shirt.
Oh, that's nice, that one, isn't it? That's lovely.
So yeah, basically that's a very long-winded way of saying that I collect books and DVDs and things, and I've got various other bits and pieces, but I'm not someone who assembles obsessively complete collections of things, if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense, and great answer to that one as well. And it's lovely to know, isn't it? Because collections are the way forward. But would you say though that in some way your experience with Doctor Who books is what got you into the writing side of it? Because you are chronicling the history of Doctor Who, and we'll come to that in a second. But is that what made you at all anyway want to be a writer?
Well, I've always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a tiny child. Ever since I can remember, I've always loved writing stories, and I've always wanted to be a novelist, a writer of fiction. The sad thing about that is I'm not very good at it, but I can sort of write to a certain level. I can write to a decent professional level, but for some reason, fiction I just don't seem to have cracked it and writing anything professionally publishable yet. But fiction, certainly very much so. When I was very young, I had things like I've got it here. I'll show you. Hang on. I've got things like the 60s, which
The 60s,
was
yes.
given to me by my parents, Christmas 1993, when I was 9 years old.
Lovely.
So certainly things like that.
How old were you in that year?
I was 9 in 1993. Yeah, I'm 39
Please.
now. But things like this, the House Stamps Walker books, their first Doctor handbook as well, which if you've read, you'll know it's got that superb section at the back, the production diary, where they assemble a sort of timeline of the series during the first Doctor's era and using all the memos and things in the BBC Written Archive Centre. So certainly when I was a child growing up in the 90s, non-fiction Doctor Who books were very big influence on me, something I very much enjoyed, and it's been a real pleasure actually. It's one of the people who's done who had a read of Pull to Open for me, which we're going to talk about later, is Stephen James Walker kindly had a read of it for me. So it was nice the fact that he was involved in all that research and really pioneering this, because I'm not really, I'm not trying to suggest that I'm chronicling stuff that hasn't been discovered. People like Hal Stamps Walker, Andrew Pixley, David Brunt, Richard Bignell, they were the people who cleared the land and plotted the route through and mapped out this journey. I'm just a tour guide coming along later to show people what's been found.
Well, it's always good because, I mean, one thing about Doctor Who, as we know, is we always welcome the new aspects coming in, and all those names you've mentioned there as well. I mean, we all know those. I grew up with their books as well in the era when Doctor Who was off air, the wilderness years, as we call it. Those books were coming forward. It was fascinating to read them all. They were really providing some much needed material for a market that was missing its main show on the television. So, it's great to see people like yourself coming in with fresh aspects and different ways of looking at stuff. And this is certainly what your two books actually do. So we've got the long game here. Now this is available right now from 10 Acre Books, and this is one that's been out for a little while. I like this. I mean, we've got the full cover here as well, courtesy of 10 Acre. Now this is the story, the inside story of how the BBC brought back Doctor Who. So this deals with the years 1996 to 2003. Why that particular time for you? What got you interested in wanting to chronicle what was going on in what was actually a very, I would imagine, internally turbulent year for the show?
Well, it's because I started to think about that there wasn't really one thing that told that story, from how it went from the aftermath of the TV movie and that not going any further to the point in September 2003 where Doctor Who was recommissioned as an ongoing series by the BBC. There was obviously lots and lots of material about what happened after September 2003, the actual making of the first run of the new series and the production of that. Lots of material about that. There's obviously lots of material about the TV movie and the period leading up to that, the Regeneration book by Philip Siegel and Gary Russell, that covers that period very well. But I felt that there were lots of different things that covered bits of the 96 to 03 period. There were some of the documentaries on the DVDs, the Doctor Forever series that they did on the DVDs that covered different aspects of that. There were various interviews and articles. Cavan Scott did a series of articles in 2013 called The Way Back, looking at the 10th anniversary of the recommissioning. So there were all sorts of bits and pieces, but I didn't think it was something that brought the whole thing together in one narrative. So the film proposals and why they didn't go further.
Oof.
Some of the other proposals that had been for television revivals when Russell T Davies first became involved in the late 90s. The online stuff, BBC Online, obviously became very important to this story because they started producing Doctor Who basically as their webcasts and were very important in establishing that the BBC did indeed have the rights to make Doctor Who still. So there were all these different aspects and they were talked about in different places, but I wanted to draw it all together in one narrative, going from the aftermath of the TV movie, May 96, it's not going any further, and then you end on that wonderful kind of high as Doctor Who rides off into the sunset to become an international phenomenon again as it's recommissioned in September 2003.
Where did you start, Paul?
Where did I start? Well, it started a few years ago. I mentioned the production diary in the first Doctor handbook and how I'd always loved that. And I thought, although I didn't have access to internal BBC documents and things, I thought, what if you could do a timeline for May 96 through to September 03 and just set out for people in a sort of blow by blow, date by date thing, what the various steps were and how these things happen with references to particular quotes and articles and other sort of evidence of things. So I put together a timeline of that, mostly just for my own entertainment, really just for fun, just for me, just because I enjoyed it. And I put that online a few years ago, and lots of people were very nice about it. They said, "Oh, this is great." And I think someone said on some forum somewhere, "Oh, there's a book in this." And then I started to think, "Oh, is there a book in it, maybe?" And I had a go at it, but it was quite short. It was only about 55,000 words, and I didn't really speak to anyone about it. I just sort of wrote up the facts, or the facts as I understood them. And then, but I kept thinking I could have a proper go at that. So a few years later, it was in 2020. I always feel funny saying it was in 2020 because it makes it sound like it was my lockdown project, and in the way that everyone had their lockdown project. It didn't feel like, because I'd kept meaning to go back to it, but then eventually I did go back to it that year, and started trying to speak to people. And amazingly, to my astonishment, because I am just some bloke, I am a nobody in the world of Doctor Who. I mean, as far as they were concerned, I was just a mad fan with a crayon, as far as they knew. But almost everyone I approached was willing to speak to me, and so I was able to put it together as a proper book. And 10 Acre very kindly published it in 2021. And it's been, a lot of people have been very, very nice about it. I think we've had someone kindly comment on the stream here.
We have,
and
that's Bedwyr. So let's just say hello to everyone that's watching. We've got the timescales, and we've got Bedwyr here. And Bedwyr does actually say, "Bravo, Paul, on a superb book."
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, lots of people were very kind about it, and I felt that I knew. I mentioned earlier about how not having done very well writing fiction, but I knew that non-fiction I could write to I don't think I'm the best writer in the world, but I can write. I knew I could write to a decent standard, and I knew it was a period that hadn't been covered in one book before, so I felt it had that unique selling point to it. But I was very, very deeply chuffed with how it went down with people, and it was a great thrill seeing people posting photos of themselves with the book on Twitter when it arrived with them and that kind of thing, and had some lovely reviews and lots of nice comments from people. So it was very pleasing, and I was let's say dead chuffed.
Yeah. When you were compiling the research into this, and as I say, between 1996, and you mentioned an awful lot of stuff there. I mean, we know about some of the proposals for alleged movies that were coming along. Personally, I say thank God none of them actually hit the television or the movie screens. To where the BBC were, because at one point, as far as I'm aware, the BBC didn't actually understand that they did own the rights to the show because of what had happened in 96. When you were unearthing the information, was there anything that really stood out as, or was there a series of things that stood out as, wow, this is a surprise?
Well, with the rights thing, it's more that a lot of people in the BBC just assumed that they didn't own the rights. And also there was the whole issue of, because they kind of knew that they didn't wholly own the rights to the Daleks, they're shared with the Terry Nation estate, that kind of transmogrified in their minds to, we don't really own the rights to Doctor Who.
Because you're dealing with generations after as well, of course. aren't you?
And I think Shannon Patrick Sullivan on his website describes it as there was poor institutional memory about the deal with Universal. The deal with Universal had given them an option on Doctor Who originally to the end of 1996. Fox Network weren't interested in taking it any further, but Universal still had the option. They could try and find another partner for it in the States, which they weren't able to, but they did. Universal, obviously someone at Universal thought it was worth pursuing, because they renewed it for another year. They renewed it up to the end of 1997. But that was it. They had an option. They renewed it to the end of 97. It expired. All rights returned to the BBC. And the BBC knew this. They put out a press release in 2000, which is quoted in the, it's republished in full, I think, in the Regeneration book by Gary Russell and Philip Siegel, saying, all rights have returned to the BBC. But then a few years after that 02-03 period, for some reason, everyone just kind of assumes that the BBC don't have the rights. I mean, one of the people I spoke to, Helen O'Reilly, who was sort of Lorraine Heggis's number 2 at BBC One, she says, "Oh, we assumed the rights were locked in a Hollywood vault somewhere." And Mal Young, one of the BBC drama executives who I also interviewed for the book, he said, "I was told, don't even go there." There was an extra complication as well, because BBC Worldwide, the commercial arm of the BBC, which dealt with merchandise, selling programs overseas, co-productions, that kind of thing, they were very keen on pushing the idea of a Doctor Who film. And there's a bit of a dispute about this, I think. Rupert Gavin from BBC Worldwide and Mike Phillips from BBC Worldwide, they've sort of the two main figures pushing for. I interviewed both of them for The Long Game, and they both insist that they never stopped BBC Television making a series. That's what they insist. The BBC Television people insist that they were told they couldn't make a series by BBC Worldwide.
So how long was that going on for, Paul?
That was going on certainly around the early 2000s, kind of 01 to 03 period. And then eventually, Lorraine Heggessey and one of the senior executives at the BBC, Alan Yentob, who of course had formerly been the controller of BBC One himself, they were able to sort of say, look, this is silly. It's not happening anymore. It's been 2 years, how long you've been working on this, trying to make a film. You haven't made the film. We want to make a television series. BBC Television is going to make a series. But there still had been that confusion. Lorraine Heggessey, if you remember around that time, 02, 03, she would often say in interviews, I'd love to make a new series of Doctor Who, but the rights are too complicated.
Yes.
And fans would write in saying, well, Doctor Who was created by BBC employees on BBC time at the behest of BBC management. So why would the BBC not own the rights? And so this is where the BBC website team were very important, because they, in 2003, no prospect of new Doctor Who on the horizon as far as they knew. Yeah. So they decided they would make a series themselves, a fully animated series, which became Scream of the Shalka. And before they did this, they wanted to establish, did the BBC have the right? Because there are all these rumours about, it's been, there's someone I quote who put up a post on Usenet saying, there will never be any more Doctor Who. I've got inside knowledge to the BBC. The rights were sold to Universal entirely, not just an option. So that was I don't know if you remember, that was the rumour at the time. The rumour was, because people love believing that the BBC is an idiot, basically. People like to believe that. And the rumour was, I don't know if you remember this, that the BBC had somehow accidentally sold Doctor Who lock, stock and barrel to Universal. And anyway, so the web team decided to sort James Goss, who ran the website. They had a researcher working for them, Daniel Judd. And Daniel Judd was told to go off, speak to everybody, the BBC Rights Group, BBC Films, BBC Worldwide, find out what the situation was. And Daniel Judd went away, spoke to everyone he needed to, and finally established that the BBC could make a new series of Doctor Who tomorrow if they wanted to. And I spoke to one of the other members of the web team, Martin Trickey, who used to run the BBC Doctor Who website. And he said it was at that point that the television people, we told the television people this, and they turned around and said, well, why aren't we making Doctor Who then? And the new series arrived shortly after that. So it was more cock up than conspiracy. There wasn't some grand conspiracy not to make Doctor Who. It was just there'd been this confusion in the beginning, and no one had really had the will to sit down and sort it out and find out the truth until the website team said, well, we're going to find out what's going on here, which then immediately killed off their own animated series, obviously, because television were now doing it. But I said to Daniel Judd when I interviewed him for the book, so are you the man who saved Doctor Who? And he said, of course I'm not, but a friend of mine likes to introduce me as that at parties.
And that's brilliant. And why wouldn't you want to do that? Because, of course, Mr. T. Davis tends to get all that honour, doesn't he? Everybody forgets about Lorraine Heggessey's part in this these days, because we're so far from this now. We're so far from that time.
She was our great hero back in the day, if you remember. She was the one who...
Well, she was for a little while. I certainly remember it because, in 2003, I was at Panopticon, the big celebration there, the Ruby anniversary.
The announcement, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Yes, Scream of the Shalka was premiered there, and we're all looking at it thinking, oh, we know this isn't going anywhere now. So we weren't really taking it, But also the fact the buzz was Lorraine Heggessey was so popular in that room. She didn't turn up, of course. She never came along, but everybody was so grateful to her. And then she's sort of been forgotten as the series has evolved and moved on, and then certain players are still around.
But I suppose that's not unusual, isn't it? I mean, how many controllers of BBC One do we remember? We don't talk about Donald Baverstock, being the controller of BBC One or chief of programs, as it was called then at the time the series first came on. So, I did feel sorry for Donald Baverstock in Adventure in Space and Time when I know why they got Mark Eden in to play him, and it was nice little that. But Mark Eden was about 50 years older than Donald Baverstock was in 1963. It seemed a little bit unfair.
It was a little bit, wasn't it? I did notice that at the time, thinking nice casting, but. So when it comes to when you were putting this book and when you're putting all this together, was there actually anything that really stood out for you as being a real shocker of what was going on there? I mean, you've talked about the whole, and you've explained the whole complex race issues, which is actually just it's bureaucratic, really, wasn't it? And the fact that there was this confusion which had been handed down from team to team to team about this whole big show. And they did get their break that you've illustrated beautifully there. But was there anything where you thought, oh, that wouldn't possibly, in your opinion, have worked?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, there's the story, isn't there, that I quote in the book Rob Shearman telling on the old Outpost Gallifrey forum. And it's almost as if I'd been subconsciously writing this book for years and years beforehand, because obviously the Outpost Gallifrey archives are gone now, so you can't access them. Sean wiped the whole thing when he shut the forum down, which, perfectly up to him. But at the time, I'd saved this post from Rob Shearman where he was talking about the series we could have got, where he writes about how he'd been aware of a series, a Doctor Who proposal a few years before the one that we got, where it would have been more like the Cushing films, and the Doctor was a human inventor who built the TARDIS in his back garden.
Oh, really?
And, yeah. And Shearman was there's a lot of speculation about who that could have been. The main speculation being that perhaps, I don't know, this is purely speculation on my part, I should say. The speculation is that perhaps it was some sort of proposal being put together by Chris Chibnall, because Shearman was working with Chris Chibnall in the early 2000s. He worked on a series that Chris Chibnall ran called Born and Bred, set in around a rural doctor's surgery in Yorkshire, I think, in the mid 1950s, with Michael French. I think Richard Wilson was in it, and various other people. Well, obviously, various other people were in it. It wasn't just two people.
Animals as well, probably.
But I did ask one of the executive producers of that series if it had been the Born, because Nev Fountain's memory as well was that, in his words, when he spoke to me, the Born and Bred team had put together a proposal, but I wasn't able to get to the truth of that one. But after the book came out, I did see some high-profile fans say that, that was Chris Chibnall's early 2000s series proposal, but that's just internet rumor. I can't verify that or say whether that's true or not. But there was certainly we've got no reason to disbelieve Rob Shearman saying there was a proposal in the early 2000s for an idea where the Doctor was a human inventor who built the TARDIS in his back garden. That seems to be true. Whether it was Chris Chibnall and the Born and Bred team who put that together, I don't know. I can't say. But certainly a lot of people seem to believe that it was.
Wow. I've never heard that one. How
serious a proposal that was, I don't know. It may have just been a conversation in the BBC bar or something, It may not have been a printed up formal, proposal document.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there were all sorts of rumours coming through in those wilderness years, right up actually till 2003, I reckon, late 2003. There were all these things. Oh, it's going to do this. We're going to have a talking TARDIS. We're going to do this. We're going to, all these.
The rapping TARDIS was from the
rapping TARDIS,
90s kind of thing, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh, I remember it well. Thank goodness for myself. Thank goodness I was able to go, oh, I don't believe any of this, because otherwise I would have been stressed to hell, Paul, I'll tell you. But it was interesting. So, I mean, there were so many different pitches. Did you actually get to hear or see about these pitches that were coming through, whether it be from the American side of stuff around about that time? And I spoke about, thank goodness they weren't made, some of those bits. But did you hear of other stuff that was going on? I mean, for example, the Verity Lambert pitch. Did you hear about any of this?
Well, that was kind of earlier. That was more, she'd been involved more in the early 90s when the BBC was first looking to put it out to independent production, which oddly in the end they didn't do. That's the funny thing, isn't it? When it went off in 89, it seemed absolutely certain that the only way it was going to come back was as an independent production. And that's actually only now happened with this new version with Russell T Davies. It's taken them over 30 years to finally, but it's interesting. When I interviewed Jane Tranter and Julie Gardner for the book, Julie Gardner said to me, there was no way the BBC would have brought it back as an independent production in 2003. It was too important a series for them to give it to an indie. Although Jane Tranter had a different view. She says, we could have given it to an indie in 2003 to make for us, but none of the indies probably would have wanted to touch it at that time. So it's interesting they had slightly different views on that. But no, so the Lambert stuff was more early. It was in sort of the first half of the wilderness years, if you will. But there was certainly plenty of proposed knock. I mean, film-wise, we went through various different ones. There was the Jeremy Bolton, Paul W. Anderson idea that people were often attaching, I think, Denzel Washington's name to.
Still in the press, yeah.
And how serious that was, I don't know. I mean, they were certainly hyping it up at the time, but David Thompson, who ran BBC Films at the time, when I interviewed him for the Long Game, he only kind of vaguely remembered Jeremy Bolt and David Thompson and Paul Anderson, sorry, as people who were sort of involved in discussions. He didn't feel that their bid was a particularly serious one, but they were certainly involved in some degree for a time. And then there was BBC Worldwide became more involved, and Rupert Gavin and Mike Phillips from BBC Worldwide were more kind of driving it. I mean, David Thompson from BBC Films, he always kind of gives the idea, or when I spoke to him, he kind of gave the idea that he was happy to go along with the idea of a Doctor Who film, but he didn't really think it would happen. The way he phrased it to me is it was just too big a thing to put in one movie. He said it would have to be the most amazing one-off film, to sort of convey Doctor Who would do. So he was happy to go along with Worldwide and see if they could do it, but he wasn't really kind of driving it. Worldwide were kind of driving it. And they got involved with an American scriptwriter called Ed Solomon, who wrote the original Men in Black, and I think Bill and Ted maybe as well, I think possibly. And he came up with a pitch about they only had the opening of the pitch, which was a young couple sort of making out in the grass in a field somewhere, and their parents are against the match, and then a sort of Anthony Hopkins type doctor runs up to them and says they absolutely must get together because the future of the world depends on it. They only had the opening, that was all they had. There wasn't really anything else after that, but it was that pitch. And TV
very Amy and Rory, isn't it?
Yeah. TV wise, there were various people who tried. Obviously there were the initial discussions with Russell T Davies in sort of late 98, early 99, which might have gone somewhere, might have ended up with a series, but at that point, Worldwide and or BBC Films insisted that their film idea had to take priority. And there was something, well, I think a lot of people know now about the Mark Gatiss, Gareth Roberts, Clayton Hickman pitch, which Graham Kibble-White spoke to them about and wrote about quite extensively in Doctor Who magazine. That's been very well covered. And Matthew Graham from Life on Mars and various other things, he didn't really have like a formal pitch, as it were. He had sort of chats with the people, kind of, wouldn't it be nice if chat, but he didn't really sort of sit down and do a. But when I interviewed him, he said it was certainly something they said to me was very common. Lots of people would come into the BBC and try and pitch Doctor Who, and of course there was Dan Friedman as well, and the man behind Death Comes to Time, who was trying to sort of get that into a TV version of Doctor Who off the ground as well. So there were certainly lots of people vying to do it. When I asked, the likes of Lorraine Heggessy and Jane Tranter and Mel Young about would you have gone with someone else if Russell hadn't wanted to do it, they weren't really sure. I mean, certainly Russell was the one that they were really sold on, and I think Russell, we call him Russell, don't we? As if I've never met the man, Russell.
Exactly, yeah.
But he has said in interviews, it wasn't so much that they wanted. I mean, they did want Doctor Who back, but they wanted him to write for the BBC, and the only thing he was going to come to the BBC and write for them was Doctor Who. So that made it. I think Russell was always their main target. Mel Young said to me they probably would have eventually done it with someone else. Whether they would have let someone else show run it, or whether they would have made it more like, because you remember at the time, certainly in British, there weren't really showrunners as such in British dramas. Yeah. You had a producer and a bunch of writers, and they would have a sort of story conference or whatever, and they would sort of vaguely plan the season out. But there wasn't really a kind of writing showrunner position in British drama so much at that time. But so Mal Young says in The Long Game that Russell was probably the only one that gave him the confidence to give him that power and that position.
Wow. And so through all that, we got to 2004. Production starts on 2004. And then, of course, in 2005, the rest is then...
Yes, the rest is history.
It really, really is. But it's great that you've got that particular documentation, this book, about the inside story of how the BBC created... the inside story of how the BBC brought back Doctor Who. From 1996 to 2000, it's a fascinating subject, really, and it's something that really was only touched on in bits and pieces. But here now, you can buy it in one big volume from Paul himself, available from 10 Acre Films.
Well, from 10 Acre, I'm afraid I don't have like a big pile of them out the back or something.
We can get it from 10 Acre Films.bigcartel.com, and that actually, I mean, having done that, Mister, having done that particular one, it's what made you then decide, well, you want to do a sequel? Well, in fact, it's actually a prequel, isn't it, really? Let's face it. Come on.
I mean, you don't have to have read one to read the other, don't worry.
Because pull to open now goes to the other. And I have to mention at this point as well that our regular subscriber and viewer, Richard, has messaged saying, this is the book that is exciting me most for this anniversary year.
Well, that's pressure now, isn't it?
I thought you might say that. So this is pull to open. Let me just show that graphic again. And this is what's described as Toby Hadoke as fresh and compelling, a definitive account of those early years as I have ever read. So this is pull to open, 1962 to 1963, the inside story of how the BBC created and launched Doctor Who.
Yes, very small subject, obviously. Just a little subject to cover.
So having done the wilderness years and the truth of what happened between 96 to 2003, what got you doing this particular one at the other side?
Well, it's a story I've always absolutely loved. I've always absolutely been fascinated by ever since I was, a little boy reading the 60s. And I think the creation of anything is fascinating, isn't it? Whether it be a television program, or maybe how a famous band got together, say Queen or the Beatles or something. Finding out, to us it seems obvious that thing exists because it's such a huge part of our culture. But looking back and see how all the parts came together and how it came to be that, I think is fascinating when you know what an impact that's gone on to have. So I've always loved the story of the creation. I've always been fascinated by it. I think it's such a fascinating period as well in British history and world history of everything else that was going on at the time. And it's a fascinating and romantic period in the BBC when you had these, people didn't know that you couldn't make, epic space stories in a 4-camera studio in an almost kind of as live fashion. That was just how television was made. So they did anything and everything in that way, and didn't worry about the idea that it was ludicrous going and doing that in the same way that you make a news program now in a small studio with 4 cameras dotted around. So it was. I find a great romance to it. I find it a fascinating period of history. But it was one I felt it had been very well covered by the people, obviously, with all the huge amount that's been written about it down the years. So I didn't necessarily think there was something I could contribute. But then I was interviewed actually after The Long Game had come out, a couple of months after, by a guy called AJ Black, who has a website where he writes about film and television. And he did an interview with me about The Long Game. And he asked me at the end, did I have another book planned? And I said, no, I don't really have an idea for another non-fiction book, but if one comes up, I'll write one. And I started thinking about it more, and I thought, well, The Long Game's gone very well. It's had lots of very nice reviews, lots of very nice comments. It's sold a nice number of copies. It would be a shame, not to try and maybe, it sounds very cynical, but I don't mean it that way, sort of capitalize on that, try and do another book. So I started thinking about what could I write about. And I also had some material because I wrote an article a couple of years ago for Doctor Who magazine about the co-creator of Doctor Who, Donald Wilson, who I'm a bit of a fan of Donald Wilson because I always feel his input gets kind of overshadowed by Sidney Newman's. Obviously, the series would never have happened if Sidney Newman hadn't initiated it, but it would never have happened, or certainly not in the form it emerged as, without Donald Wilson. And Donald probably named the show as well, and he never seems to get the credit. So I'd written a piece about him for Doctor Who magazine, and it had been on their back burner for a while. It eventually came out. When it came out, for various reasons, there wasn't space for all that I'd written. It had to be quite a bit shorter. So I had a huge amount I'd written about Donald Wilson, which I was wondering what to do with. So I thought, well, I could do a chapter about Donald Wilson. But if it's a chapter about Donald Wilson, what's it a chapter of? And then I realised that the book I could write, when most of the other accounts of the creation of Doctor Who are written, they tend to be the start of the story. So in the 60s, it's the start of the story of Doctor Who in the 60s. And the first Doctor handbook, it's covering the whole first Doctor era. But I thought, what if you made the creation the story? What if it ends with Doctor Who getting on the air? Actually, the book goes a little bit further. That goes up to the end of 1963. But what if the creation, rather than being the start of the story, was the whole story? So that's the idea of pull to open. It is the story of the creation of Doctor Who as a book in and of itself, not just the start of a story, then goes on to tell later bits, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I love this because you're seeing things out of the box. No pun intended if there's one that, but you're seeing things out of the box here with both of these titles, and this one especially, because you're absolutely right. When we've looked at books before, they'll start from, I don't know, Verity Lambert and Sidney Newman and Donald, and this sort of element going through from Hartnell's cast, and it never really has had that whole breadth of what's come before, has it really, to its first airing, or as you say, going into a little bit after 1963. Again, I'm going to ask you though, you set yourself a real challenge here. Another real challenge. Where did you start on this one, Paul?
I sat down and I wrote the words, when did Doctor Who begin? That's how I started. And those are still the first words in the book, I think. Yeah, in the beginning of chapter 1. Yeah, I suppose I just started thinking about the story as I would like to tell it. So one of the things people seem to like about the long game, and one of the things I'd wanted to do with the long game, was explain not just that things had happened, but why they had happened. So trying to sort of explain a bit about how the BBC worked at that particular time, how the people who ended up in those positions at that point got to those positions. So one of the things I was very keen to do with Pull to Open was to explore a bit the lives of people who were often just names on a list. People like Alice Frick and John Braben and Donald Bull and Eric Maschwitz, people who we were aware of as names at the very start of this whole thing, but we don't really know anything much about. So I wanted to try and flesh out some of the lives of people who were involved in the series and explain how they came to be in those positions at that point, and try and explain as well the kind of inner workings and machinations of the BBC in the early 60s.
Wow. As I say, this is a big, I mean, my head's spinning through that as well. I mean, and it's great because these people all contributed to this birth of our favorite telly show, this British institution, this legend, which of course in this year of 2023 is celebrating its 60th. When it came to the researching on this, then, was it easy? Did you find it easy to unearth all these documents, which are now 60 years old or more, really?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, a lot of them have been catalogued before. I mean, the first Doctor handbook reprints a lot of the documentation, but I was lucky enough. I'd been to Caversham, or I've been to the BBC Written Archive Centre at Caversham a fair few times for various projects, luckily, both because I think I mentioned it in my day job. I work for the BBC. And not that gives me special.
You can get in,
but well, no, yeah, anyone can get in. It's open to any outside researchers who are working on any serious projects. But I've been there various times, sometimes for in-house BBC stuff when I was working on programs that were documentaries about archive stuff. But also I've been there as an outside researcher as well. No, they're great people at the BBC Written Archive Centre. They're fantastically helpful, really dedicated, and it's a brilliant place to go. And so if you're ever working on a project where you might require some information about the BBC, do drop them a line, and they're very helpful. But I've been lucky enough to go before for Doctor Who purposes when I was researching Donald Wilson's life for the DWM piece, and then I went back again last year. And it's always, it's such a privilege having those documents actually on the table in front of you and being able to go through them.
Wow.
Like, that thing about, they say Howard Carter, when he discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, looked through the gap and said, I can see wonderful things.
Yeah,
it feels like that when you carefully turn these things over, and some of them are the little flimsy BBC memo slips that are thin and delicate as tracing paper. And you see these quotes, some of these famous quotes and things that you've seen now, those famous 2 pages of script that Sidney Newman scribbled his thoughts on the pilot on the back of.
No, really?
Things like that, yeah.
Do you know, as you're talking, I'm picturing a movie about you researching this.
Hardly. As I said earlier, I'm not so much, there's bits and pieces in the book where I think I've found some stuff that hasn't been mentioned before, right, and bits where I'm able to sort of correct things maybe that were misunderstood before, but I'm not trying to paint myself as some great, discoverer. I mean, this is standing on the shoulders of giants. This was all mapped out years ago by the likes of David J. House, Stephen James Walker, David Brunt, Andrew Pixley, Richard Bignell, all these people who've done this fantastic work. I'm just trying to tell sort of my version of the story, as it were. That makes it sound like I've got a particular angle. I guess maybe to an extent I have an angle, in the sense that I want to try and give some credit to people who I think haven't always had as much of it as they deserve before. But I'm not trying to sort of construct a version of events. I'm just trying to lay out what, as far as we know. Of course, in a lot of circumstances and a lot of events through it, we don't know what happens. So they just have to say, just to present the facts as they're known, and say, what might have happened and let the reader make up their own mind. But so I'm not some, Indiana Indiana Jones figure
No.
got on Dora and ducking through archive rails and racks of archive documents, and it's not like that at all. I'm taking advantage of a lot of very hard work that's been done before by a lot of very dedicated people.
I love the fact that you're doing that as well, and I want to come back to the fact that you were trying to shine a light on a lot of uncredited people here, because
but we know their names and they've been mentioned, but they don't always get as much attention as when the book is just about the creation. You've got the time and space, excuse the pun, to do that. Whereas in the book, like the 60s, they couldn't really touch on those people's lives because they had so much more to cover. But when the book is just about the creation, you've got more opportunity to go into those areas.
Absolutely. We've got timescales here, and he's actually saying there should be a movie of Paul Hays. Great to see this being
It would be a very, very boring film, I can assure you.
I'm sure we could spice it up. But no, this is so when it was coming to the long game and you're preparing that, how long did it take you to actually get all this together ready for publication?
What, for Pull to Open or the long game?
For Pull to Open.
Pull to Open, yeah. Well, I sat down and started writing it in January last year, so January 2022. Yeah. I had a sort of a finished draft, a version by the end of last year. And then this year I've been sort of correcting it. I had to shorten it a bit just because it was too long, basically.
Really? You found that much out?
So I had to, it's not so much I've had to cut sort of facts or information out, but I just kind of make my writing a bit snappier,
Okay.
And so there was a version at the end of last year. This year we've been sort of proofing it and refining it, and had to wait a little while for certain bits and pieces to fall into place. But so the actual writing took about a year, and then there's been quite a bit of sort of tweaking and editing after that.
As we're broadcasting live for this, and thank you very much if you're watching for us. If you've got any questions for Paul, please do pop them into the comments box and we'll get them to him. He's very happy to answer any questions.
As long as it's about Doctor Who, I don't know if I can help you on anything else.
Yeah, no medical or anything like that.
No, definitely not.
So as we're broadcasting live tonight, the book is due out next month in August 2020.
Yes, we've had to put this is an exclusive for you now. It was due out this coming Monday, the 24th, but we've sort of been victims of our own success. It's apparently, so I'm told, the biggest pre-sale first run order that 10 Acres has ever had. So it's going to take a bit longer to actually do the first print run. So it's actually been put back by 2 weeks. So I'm sorry if you got it on order and you're going to have to wait a couple of weeks. It will be out now on August the 7th. So it's been a 2-week delay. Nothing sinister, but apologies for that if you're hoping for it to fall on your doormat on Monday.
Do you know what, though? Doctor Who fans, bless us, we're used to delays with certain pieces of merchandise.
Yeah, famously so laid back and patient as well.
At least this is a short one, and we do have a date for it. But it's great that it's absolutely wonderful to hear that the pre-orders have been so successful for you on this. I'm really looking forward to reading it as well. As I said, because we're waiting for this to come, and none of us have seen it. Who did you get to interview? Who did you go to first, and where did that take you? What was the journey about? Finding all the information.
The difference it's very different between the long game and Pull to Open, because obviously with the long game, I interviewed over 30 people for that. But obviously with this, it's much further back. So there's very few people left alive, sadly, now who you can go and speak to. I spoke to so a lot of it is sourcing quotes from interviews that were done in the past with various people, and researching through documents. But I did do some of my own interviews for the book. I interviewed Waris Hussein and Carol Ann Ford and Bernard Lodge, who did the titles. And I also had an interview for great titles. I also did I did an interview for radio a few years ago with Brian Hodgson from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop.
Oh, cool!
Who obviously helped create the Dalek voices, and he created the TARDIS takeoff sound. Yes. And he was there, when Delia Derbyshire and Dick Mills were producing the theme tune. So those are kind of the only sort of contemporary interviews that I've done for that. But I've looked back through as many interviews as I could find with people like Sidney Newman and Verity Lambert and many of the others. Donald Wilson is it's really frustrating with Donald Wilson because in 1990, I mean, he was alive till 2002, and according to his daughters, he was fully compos mentis till the end, and yet fandom never caught up with him, which is such a shame. He did a very long and in-depth oral history interview for a project run by the film industry union BECTU and the British Film Institute in 1991, in which he talks in great depth and very interestingly about his life and career. And doesn't mention Doctor Who once. And,
really?
I know it's getting towards the end of the interview. You think, well, he's not going to mention Doctor Who. He's not going to mention Doctor Who, and he doesn't. And sadly, the woman that they doing the interview, I don't think wasn't aware of his role, because she was mostly interested in his film career, because he worked in film from the 30s up to the 50s, and then he moved into television. And she did talk to him about it, but it was clear that she was more interested in his film career than his television career. And so I just don't think genuinely that in 1991, the 60s hadn't come out yet, the handbook hadn't come out yet. Most people wouldn't have known that Donald Wilson had been involved in the creation of Doctor Who, and
True.
He didn't bring it up, and she didn't ask him about it. So as far as I know, the only interview where he talks about Doctor Who, Donald Wilson, was with Malcolm Hulke in 1971, because Malcolm Hulke, as well as writing lots of Doctor Who stories, Malcolm Hulke was the first person ever to research, from a historic viewpoint, the creation of Doctor Who, because he and Terence Dicks wrote a book called The Making of Doctor Who, which came out in 1972. And for that, I think Malcolm Hulke did most of the kind of legwork on the book. Yeah. And in 1971, Malcolm Hulke was the first person to, from a historical standpoint, try and research how Doctor Who came about. And so he got in contact with Sidney Newman, Verity Lambert, David Whittaker, and Donald Wilson. And we know that he did a telephone interview with Donald Wilson. He recorded the telephone interview. He had a transcript of it typed up, but the interview as a whole doesn't survive. But Graham Burke, when he edited Sidney Newman's memoirs, which came out a few years ago, he found in Sidney Newman's papers that Malcolm Hulke had sent Sidney Newman a couple of pages of this transcript of this interview.
What?
Because basically Malcolm Hulke had written, Sidney Newman had written to Malcolm Hulke and said, yeah, it was all my idea. I created Doctor Who. It was all me. And then Malcolm Hulke wrote back to him and said, well, you've posed a bit of a problem here, Sidney, because you've said this, but I've done an interview with Donald, and Donald says this, and he sends Newman a couple of pages of the type.
Oh, yeah.
Where Donald basically says they created it together, the two of them. And Sidney, this surprised me actually, because Sidney Newman, as we know in the 80s, would tell anyone who'd listened that he created Doctor Who, and he tried to have his name added to the end titles. He got very angry with Trivial Pursuit when they accidentally said that Terry Nation created Doctor Who.
I remember that. Yeah.
So he in the 80s, he was very firm on the I created Doctor Who. But when Malcolm Hulke knew Sidney Newman because they'd worked together at ABC. Malcolm Hulke had written armchair theatre plays for him. He'd written the Pathfinders serials, so they knew each other. And Malcolm wrote back to him and said, "Well, yeah, you've said this, Sidney, but Donald says this." And it's interesting how, rather than kind of launching a broadside back, Newman writes back and says, "Oh, well, actually, yeah, maybe Donald did do that." But then he says to Malcolm Hulke at the end of the letter, he says, "I can afford to be relaxed about this, Mac, because there's no money involved."
Well, that's the point. I was going to say to you, I don't know why he was quibbling all those years, because there was never any money in it for him, because it became, as you said, as you had found out, it became a BBC property. It
didn't just become, it always was, because it was made by BBC employees
on BBC ground
time, so it belonged to the BBC. That's one of the nice things about Doctor Who. I think it belongs to us. It belongs to all of us. Remember those trails the BBC ran last year for its centenary? The BBC belongs to all of us. And because Doctor Who belongs to the BBC, Doctor Who belongs to all of us, which is kind of nice, really.
Yeah. It's interesting how in its 60th anniversary year we're looking at that sort of aspect, because it is something to be proud of. I mean, this is the longest running science fiction show in the world.
Yeah. A bit of a gap in the middle, but
yeah, we don't talk about the gap in the middle. But
do you remember how angry all the fans got when Guinness World Records gave it to Stargate, because they said Stargate was the longest continuously running
I added my name to the letter. Yes,
and there were lots of Doctor Who fans all over the world going.
we were not. I remember in the pub. Yeah, fans were everywhere to go. I added my name to that letter. It was a letter as well. I think there were several letters going around because I don't think there wasn't really anything online back then. But yeah, there was really this real big thing that was coming through from various Doctor Who fans from all over the world. From I say, excuse me, you might want to look at that actually.
One could almost think maybe Guinness did it deliberately to draw attention and get publicity for their book. Maybe.
Well, the Guinness Book of Records was losing sales up until that point. I'm saying no more. Allegedly.
Where's Stargate now, eh?
Who?
Yeah.
we don't even know what we're talking about now, Paul. No. We've gone off the rails now, so that's fine. But I mean, when it comes to Pull to Open as well, I mean, did you find that it was an easy write for you, an easy way of producing the book? Was it? Did it all come together for you in a natural style?
Yeah, I think so. I certainly enjoyed writing it very much. I mean, I enjoyed the long game as well, but yeah, it was. Yes, I think so. I mean, there's always. I suppose it's slightly more worrying in one respect than the long, because with the long game, I knew that it wasn't an area that people knew as well. There hadn't been as much written about it.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the reasons it made a good selling point for the long game. But on the other hand, it means that with Pull to Open, there's going to be far more people, ready to go on the internet and say, "Oh, you've got that wrong."
Well, that's the problem with today, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's not just, but I hate the idea of, I don't want to mislead people or say something that isn't true, or turn out to have completely misunderstood something, So people have kindly read, as I say, Stephen James Walker's read it, David Brunt's read it, Sam Guerria's read it. So there are people who know their stuff. Toby Haydock, of course, has read it. So there are people who seriously know their stuff who've read this. And one or two people, actually Simon Guerria, he's written or writing the biography of David Whittaker, which 10 Acre are also going to put out probably later this year. Again, there's no date for that one yet, but that will come out.
That's exciting.
He did point out to me about one of the chaps. He said, "Well, you said this particular memo doesn't exist, but it does exist. It's in this other file." And I was like, "Oh, right, okay, yeah." So he saved me on that particular one there. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there will be some sort of mistake in there somewhere. I hope there isn't, because I really, if you do spot a mistake in it, it's not because I haven't absolutely tried to do my very best with this and gone over it again and again and again with a fine tooth comb. But then again, sometimes you just get supplanted by new information. I'm sure there'll be another book that comes out down the line where they've managed to find out something that I didn't realize or hadn't found out. Or it's amazing how sometimes you spot stuff in the paperwork which was always there, but like, for instance, for a long time you'll see it written in lots of places that the first ever shooting for Doctor Who was done on August the 20th, 1963. For the titles, but actually that's not true. It didn't happen. That filming session was cancelled. And it says it's in the documentation. It's written there on one of the film booking sheets. That session was cancelled, and yet for all the years since, in a lot of the guides and things, you'll find August 20th. And Toby Haydock writes about this in the forward he did. He said it was such a great date because it's Sophie Aldred's birthday, it's Sylvester McCoy's birthday, it's Anthony Ainley's birthday, it's Andre Morel's birthday from Quatermass. But yeah, it didn't happen. August 20th, no shooting was done for the titles. So that's
amazing.
Yeah,
but basically what you're saying, that's become an old wives' tale then, really, in Doctor Who.
Well, see, I don't know why. I just think because I don't know why. Like, it's almost there's documents booking that date, but then one of the other documents further on cancels it, and for some reason, people down the years had spotted it being booked, but not the one that cancels it. So I was looking through this and I thought, well, that didn't happen. And I emailed Toby last year because it's something he talked about in his podcast series. And I said, are you sure about, because this bit of paper says it didn't happen. So yeah, it makes me sound very smug, as if I go, actually, I think you're fine. But people will be doing that to me very soon. I'm very sure.
Oh, I'm sure they won't be. I'm really looking forward to reading this. And it's amazing. I love the way that you all supported each other when it comes to this, to try and make sure that the facts are as cross-referenced and as researched and as solid as possible.
Kind, actually, because it makes it so people are going to think I'm part of some clique of Doctor Who. So I don't really know any of these people. They're just very nice, and I think people are appreciative of other people being genuinely interested in and genuinely trying to establish the facts. And I don't know Simon or David or Toby at all, really, but or Richard Bignell, who was kind enough to help me with different queries. Mark Ayres was very kind to help me out with some queries about sort of sound issues.
Wow.
I don't know, I'm not sort of mates with any of these people, but if you write them a nice, polite email and explain what you're researching, it turns out that they're nice people and will help you. So it restores your faith in humanity.
It really, really does. But again, I think it restores our faith really in the wider scale of being a Doctor Who fan, because I mean, I was saying on a previous Merchandise Paradise, you can expect every 10 years on an anniversary year something to be released which is the Chronicles of Doctor Who. I mean, it's been going on since 1983 with a celebration written by Peter Haining, and then we've had various and some have been a hit, some have been a miss.
The first time that Peter Haining wrote his book.
Ooh.
Actually, no, that's a nasty thing to say. Actually, I know that is an unpleasant, because when I was a kid, I used to love. There used to be two. They used to the local library in the town. They had the Key to Time one.
Oh yes, the 21st anniversary.
Yeah, I used to get that out of the library a lot. And my school library had the 25 Glorious Years one, and I used to get that
for the 25th anniversary.
Yes. Yeah.
you can see a theme. But the thing about this was, they either tend to rehash things, or they try, even the later ones really try to rehash things or maybe rejiggle things, and it's the same thing in a possibly different order, or with a bit of merchandise thrown in to some of the later ones or whatever. What you've done here is you've given fandom something a little bit fresh. It's a different viewpoint, and I just want to congratulate on it. It sounds like it's going to be a really good read, and I can't wait to get my grubby little protuberances on it.
No, well, as I say, it's an attempt to tell that story and also give a bit of wider background and context about the BBC at the time and British television at the time, and who these people were who did this. And I taste there's little bits, doesn't go overboard into this, but little bits of sort of social and cultural history of what was going on in the world at the time as well. Just try and give some idea of what the world was that Doctor Who sprang from.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Hayes.
Yes.
What's next?
Oh, I don't know. Again, I don't have a particular idea for another Doctor Who book, but I'm not sure if there is a third one in the trilogy. I can't think of another a period of Doctor Who where I could write a book with a 6-figure word count about Doctor Who, covering a period when Doctor Who was not being made. I'm not sure if it's or mostly not being made. I'm not sure the third one in that.
Maybe there's something. I'm sure something's going to come to your mind. VHS, maybe. I don't know. The Chronicles of there's a whole world of
there's far better people to chronicle that kind of thing than me. But I don't know. I mean, as I've said, I'd love to write some, because I've done a fair bit of professional non-fiction writing now, these books and another book I wrote a while ago and various articles and things. But I'd love to somehow get in there someday and write a bit of fiction, So
fabulous.
If anyone from Big Finish is responsible for sort of commissioning short stories and wants to drop me an email, I'm available. I might not be very good, but I'm available.
Well, I don't know. I'm sure there's a novel in there for you somewhere. Obviously, you've got to keep going.
Everyone has a novel inside them. For most people, it should stay there.
Well, that's where I'm putting myself completely and utterly in that one. So listen, we've got these here. We've been talking about the long game, which is available right now from 10 Acre, and I'll bring the banner up for them there as well. It's 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com. Oh, I sounded a bit like a car salesman then.
You got that. That's 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com.
Bigcartel.com. It's available now. And Pull to Open, you can pre-order from 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com. And that's coming out very, very soon, in a few weeks' time, in August.
Delay, but panic ye not, it will be with you. Just a short 2-week delay, August the 7th.
And I have to say as well, what lovely covers they are. They are gorgeous
Yeah, the
covers.
great. It's Stuart sort of designed them, and then
This is Stuart Manning, isn't it?
Yes, Stuart Manning, who runs 10 Acre, and a very talented artist called Andrew Orton, who many people will be familiar with, all sorts of stuff he puts on social media. So he does sort of CGI recreations of the set layout in the studio of sort of different Doctor Who stories and things like that. Yeah. And they Stuart and Andrew very kindly have provided those wonderful covers.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. And speaking of wonderful covers, 10 Acre have very kindly asked me to put these through. These are two classics from 10 Acre, who are obviously publishing your books here. We've got Andrew Cartmell's script Doctor, and then Richard Martin's Drama and Delight, which is the life and legacy of Verity Lambert. So actually, these tie in beautifully, Paul, with what you've written here.
Books. And Richard's book, Drama and Delight, especially, was obviously a great resource for me, very helpful with covering aspects of her life and her first involvement in the series with Pull to Open. Again, Richard is someone who I don't know, but I was able to email him and checking and clarifying a couple of facts and things, and because I think I had a slightly different date for when, because I went through the this makes me sound like a stalker. I went through the immigration records on Ancestry, and I had a different date for her going to the US than he did. I think she actually went to the US a bit earlier than he places it. She went over there in 59, and he had it slightly later. But she goes over there in a liner in 59.
Really? This is amazing, all the stuff that's coming up.
It's a great story about her meeting, because she was working over there for an American producer called David Suss. Basically, she sort of thought she wasn't getting anywhere in the UK industry, so she decided to try her luck in America. She went to work for an American producer called David Susskind. And while she was over there, a Canadian director based in Britain called Alvin Rakoff also went over to do some work for David Susskind. And his wife went with him, and his wife was Jacqueline Hill. And there's a story that Lambert would later tell, that she was walking down Fifth Avenue in America thinking she didn't like any of the hairstyles on any of the women that were there, until she saw one that she liked, and she realized it was being worn by Jacqueline Hill. And so she went over and renewed their acquaintance.
I love that story. That is fabulous. Absolutely gorgeous. Wow, the things you learn on this show. and because of that, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed our chat here. We've got
more stories of Doctor Who hairstyles.
Hey, listen, don't laugh. I could do that, Paul. I'll tell you. But please do like and please do subscribe to the channel. It's been an absolute pleasure. But there we go. Andrew Cartmell's Script Doctor and Richard Martin's Drama and Delight, available right now from 10 Acre Films. One thing I have to say about these is that these are best sellers, and they sell very, very, very quickly. So if you haven't got these and you're interested in it, I mean, I've got the first editions of both of these from a long time ago. If you're interested in getting them, you've got to get your order in right now, actually, because they never stay on the shelf, and they've become sort of like special editions. They're released every so often.
Well, 10 Acre, I think obviously because 10 Acre is quite a small publisher, they don't have masses of storage for tons of stock, so they can't keep sort of thousands of copies on hand. But there are sort of new print runs every so often when demand builds up for a book again. So the best thing to do is if one of their titles is out of print, drop them an email via the website and just remind them that the people are looking forward to it again, and they'll probably do another print run.
Inside knowledge here now on Who's Views Merchandise Paradise.
I think Stuart has tweeted about that before, so I don't think I'm sharing any trade secrets.
No, I think he probably has. Listen, Paul, I've had a great time talking to you. Thank you for joining me here. It's
always nice to sit down and chat about Doctor Who, because it's my favourite thing in the world. So, and
it really comes through. And listen, good luck with the book.
Thank you.
Come back at some point and tell me how it's all going. And also, when you decide on that third book is, let me know here on Who's Views Merchandise Paradise. Listen, you have been watching Who's Views Merchandise Paradise Special, an interview or a chit-chat with the lovely Paul Hayes. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Really pleased to see you. Please do like and subscribe. We'd like to see you. You can have a look at some of all the other stuff we're doing, including Who's Views Reviews, Who's Views Sunday Breakfast Live Show, and obviously lots more Merchandise Paradise coming up. And we've got a plethora of stuff coming up for you as we celebrate this 60th anniversary year on the channel for Doctor Who, our favourite show. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again, Paul. Thank you for everybody who was in the chat. Let's just see. I've just had a couple of comments here. We've got oh, hello. I like this one from the timescales. Good job, JT. Looking great too. Yes.
Well,
Thank you
quite
very
so,
much.
quite so.
He's after something. Yes. But he's also said thanks for a fun afternoon, because of course he's one of our viewers outside the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Lovely to see you. I'd like to say thank you to everybody that joined us, including Timescales, Bedweir, and to Richard as well, who's again, I'm going to tell you, this is the book that is exciting him most for this, the 60th anniversary.
Well, yeah, that's fingers crossed it lives up to it.
I'm sure it will. Until next time, again, thanks, Paul, and we'll see you again next time here on Whose Views. Thank you. Bye-bye.